I'm at your bedroom window. A warning to my fellow travelers. If you ever have a layover in Philly overnight, don't spend the night at the Economy Motel. And if you absolutely must, steer clear of room 103. I was heading south to visit some family members for a few weeks, and unfortunately the only flight available included a 7-hour layover in Philadelphia. Not wanting to spend those nights huddled outside the airport, I rented the cheapest motel I could find and took the shuttle over around 11 p.m. The place was just about the shadiest looking motel I'd ever seen, but it was a bed, right? I checked in and headed to my room, 103. Exhausted, I immediately collapsed on the bed, a bit lumpy but not terrible. Not bothering to take my contacts out, I closed my eyes and let my thoughts wander. I was yanked back to reality by a loud grumbling from my stomach. Right, the airline hadn't fed us. Annoyed, I dug around in my bag for one of those microwavable soup cups, which I tossed in the room's microwave. As the microwave rattled away, I noticed a piece of paper wedged underneath it. I yanked it out and unfolded it. There were 2 words scribbled on it hastily. Don't look. Whatever. I tossed it aside and retrieved my soup. Feeling lonely, I hopped online to see if anyone was on. I was in luck. My long-distance boyfriend happened to be on Skype. I called him up and we chatted a while, trying to keep our voices down. Eventually, though, he said something that made me laugh, and I heard a muffled curse come from upstairs. Feeling guilty, I said my goodnights and ended the call, with the intention of getting a bit of rest before my next flight. As I lay in the now dark room, I noticed a stream of light coming from where the curtain didn't close completely. Annoyed, I got up to close it. I was almost at the window when I heard it.
I can see into your bedroom.
The voice sent a chill up my spine. It was quiet and high-pitched, like a child's. It was so soft, I wasn't sure I hadn't just imagined it. I shook my head and reached for the curtain.
I know you can hear me. I'm at your bedroom window, and I know you can hear me.
I jumped back as soon as the shadow crossed the stream of light coming into my room. I definitely hadn't imagined it that time. There was a voice directly outside my door. Someone was out there, looking in. I jumped back into bed and pulled the covers up to my chin.
I'm at your bedroom window. I know you can hear me. I can see into your bedroom. Are you listening to me? I know you can hear me. Come, take a look. I'm at your bedroom window.
The taunting went on and on, rattling into my thoughts and leaving me paralyzed in fear. Suddenly, I heard the tenant upstairs moving around again. Footsteps stomped over to the door above, and I heard muffled shouting.
Hey, shut up down there. This isn't funny. I have work in 4 hours.
The door upstairs slammed, and there was silence. I breathed a sigh of relief and leaned back against the pillow, determined to get some sleep.
I'm still out here. Come look out your window.
I sat straight up, heart pounding in my ears. The voice was back. It whispered on and on, repeating its mantra over and over again. I put my hands over my ears and rocked back and forth, trying to block out the sound. It was no use. The longer I sat there, the louder it got, until I could hear it so clearly, it sounded like it was right next to me. Frantic, I picked up the phone and dialed the police. Stammering and stuttering in fright, I managed to give them the information. Where I was, what was wrong, please help, I'm scared. I didn't care if it was a prank at this point. My mind was reeling in terror. The officers assured me they would be over shortly to see what the issue was. I thanked them and hung up the phone. As soon as I did, silence descended over the room. It wasn't just that the voice stopped, no. Utter silence filled the room. The air conditioner stopped. The street noises outside ceased. Even the faint hum of electricity from the TV and lights went away. It pressed on my ears with a tangible heaviness that sent shivers through me. Next to me, my phone rang. The caller ID told me that was the police station, calling me back. Cautiously, I picked it up and answered. "Hello?" I whispered.
"They aren't coming,"
growled the voice. And every light went out, plunging the room into complete and total darkness. The statue. A few years ago, a mother and father decided they needed a break, so they wanted to head out for a night on the town. They called their most trusted babysitter. When the babysitter arrived, the two children were already fast asleep in bed, so the babysitter just got to sit around and make sure everything was okay with the children. Later that night, the babysitter got bored and wanted to watch TV, but she couldn't watch it downstairs because they did not have cable downstairs. The parents didn't want the children watching too much garbage. So, she called them and asked them if she could watch cable in the parents' room. Of course, the parents said it was okay, but the babysitter had one final request. She asked if she could cover up the angel statue outside the bedroom window with a blanket or cloth, because it made her nervous. The phone was silent for a moment. Then the father who was talking to the babysitter at the time said, "Take the children and get out of the house. We will call the police. We don't own an angel statue." The police found both the children and the babysitter slumped in pools of their own blood within 3 minutes of the call. No statue was found. Daddy, are you awake? We're a small family of 4, the 2 of us and 2 kids, 4 and 3 years old. My daughter is the older one, and for the last year has had nightmares off and on. Some mornings I'll wake up with her wedged firmly between my wife and I, which is fine. We've all been there. I have no problem with it. But what I do have a problem with is when she walks in 20 minutes after we've turned the lights off and the house is dark, just to stand next to my bed on my side and stare at me. I get the sensation that I'm not alone, and wake up with a dark little silhouette right next to my face. Although at times it sends me into a slight panic, or at least leaves me with slight chills. It's not very manly or dad-like, I'll admit. I'll break the silence. "Yes, sweetie?" She'll usually ask me if I'm awake and tell me she's had bad dreams. I'll let her climb into my bed with us at that point, and that's the end of it. Well, last night, the same thing happened. I got the uneasy feeling that I wasn't alone. My eyelids opened, and there she was again, a dark little silhouette mere inches from my face. "What is it, sweetie?" I asked. No response. Just silence. Then it clicked that both my kids were staying with my in-laws for the night. I no longer wonder why my daughter wants to sleep in our bed. I was able to reach up and flip on the light, but of course there was no one there. However, I looked down the hallway and into my daughter's room, and the silhouette is standing in the doorway and hasn't moved for the last hour. I think it's waiting for my daughter to come home. Mr. Widemouth. During my childhood, my family was like a drop of water in a vast river, never remaining in one location for long. We settled in Rhode Island when I was 8, and there we remained until I went to college in Colorado Springs. Most of my memories are rooted in Rhode Island, but there are fragments in the attic of my brain which belong to the various homes we had lived in when I was much younger. Most of these memories are unclear and pointless. Chasing after another boy in the backyard in a house in North Carolina, trying to build a raft to float on the creek behind the apartment we rented in Pennsylvania, and so on. But there is one set of memories which remain as clear as glass, as though they were just made yesterday. I often wonder whether these memories are simply lucid dreams produced by the long sickness I experienced that spring, but in my heart, I know they're real. We were living in a house just outside the bustling metropolis of New Vineyard, Maine, population 643. It was a large structure, especially for a family of 3. There were a number of rooms that I didn't even see in the past 5 months that we resided there. In some ways, it was a waste of space, but it was the only house on the market at the time, at least within an hour's commute of my father's place of work. The day after my 5th birthday, attended by my parents alone, I came down with a fever. The doctor said I had mononucleosis, which meant no rough play and more fever for at least another 3 weeks. It was a horrible time to be bedridden. We were in the process of packing our things to move to Pennsylvania, and most of my things were already packed away in boxes, leaving my room barren. My mother brought me ginger ale and books several times a day, and these served the function of being my primary form of entertainment for the next few weeks. Boredom always loomed just around the corner, waiting to rear its ugly head and compound my misery. I don't exactly recall how I met Mr. Widemouth. I think it was about the week after I was diagnosed with mono. My first memory of the small creature was asking him if he had a name. He told me to call him Mr. Widemouth, because his mouth was large. In fact, everything about him was large in comparison to his body. His head, his eyes, his crooked ears. But his mouth was by far the largest. "You look kind of like a Furby," I said as he flipped through one of my books. Mr. Widemouth stopped and gave me a puzzled look. "Furby? What's a Furby?" he asked. I shrugged. "You know, the toy. The little robot with big ears, and you can pet and feed him. Almost like a real pet." "Oh." Mr. Widemouth resumed his activity. "You don't need one of those. They aren't the same as having a real friend." I remember Mr. Widemouth disappearing every time my mother stepped in to check on me. "I lay under your bed," he later explained. "I don't want your parents to see me because I'm afraid they won't let us play anymore." We didn't do much those first few days. Mr. Widemouth just looked at my books, fascinated by the stories and pictures they contained. The 3rd or 4th morning after I met him, he greeted me with a large smile on his face. "I have a new game we can play," he said. "We have to wait until your mother comes in to check on you, because she can't see us play it. It's a secret game." After my mother delivered more books and soda at the usual time, Mr. Widemouth slipped out from under the bed and tugged my hand. "We have to go to the room at the end of this hallway," he said. I objected at first, as my parents had forbidden me to leave my bed without their permission, but Mr. Widemouth persisted until I gave in. The room in question had no furniture or wallpaper. Its only distinguishing feature was a window opposite the doorway. Mr. Widemouth darted across the room and gave the window a firm push, flinging it open. He then beckoned me to look out at the ground below. We were on the 2nd story of the house, but it was built on a hill, and from this angle the drop was farther than 2 stories due to the incline. "I like to play pretend up here," Mr. Widemouth explained. "I pretend there's a big, soft trampoline below this window, and I jump. If you pretend hard enough, you bounce back up like a feather. I want you to try." I was a 5-year-old with a fever, so only a hint of skepticism darted through my thoughts as I looked down and considered the possibility. "It's a long drop," I said. "But that's all part of the fun. It wouldn't be fun if it was only a short drop. If it were that way, you might as well just bounce on a real trampoline." I toyed with the idea, picturing myself falling through thin air only to bounce back up to the window on something unseen by human eyes. But the realist in me prevailed. "Maybe some other time," I said. "I don't know if I have enough imagination. I could get hurt." Mr. Widemouth's face contorted into a snarl, but only for a moment. Anger gave way to disappointment. "If you say so," he said. He spent the rest of the day under my bed, quiet as a mouse. The following morning, Mr. Widemouth arrived holding a small box. "I want to teach you how to juggle," he said. "Here's some things you can use to practice before I start giving you lessons." I looked in the box. It was full of knives. "My parents will kill me," I shouted, horrified that Mr. Widemouth had brought knives into my room, objects that my parents would never allow me to touch. "I'll be spanked and grounded for a year." Mr. Widemouth frowned. "It's fun to juggle with these. I want you to try it." I pushed the box away. "I can't. I'll get in trouble. Knives aren't safe to just throw in the air." Mr. Widemouth's frown deepened into a scowl. He took the box of knives and slid under my bed, remaining there for the rest of the day. I began to wonder how often he was under me. I started having trouble sleeping after that. Mr. Widemouth often woke me up at night, saying he put a real trampoline under the window, a big one that I couldn't see in the dark. I always declined and tried to go back to sleep, but Mr. Widemouth persisted. Sometimes he stayed by my side early in the morning, encouraging me to jump. He wasn't so fun to play with anymore. My mother came in one morning and told me I had her permission to walk around outside. She thought the fresh air would be good for me, especially after being confined in my room for so long. Ecstatic, I put on my sneakers and trotted out to the back porch, yearning for the feeling of sun on my face. Mr. Widemouth was waiting for me. "I have something I want you to see," he said. I must have given him a weird look, because he then said, "It's safe. I promise." I followed him to the beginning of a deer trail which ran through the woods behind our house. "This is an important path," he explained. "I've had a lot of friends about your age. When they were ready, I took them down this path, to a special place. You aren't ready yet, but one day I hope to take you there." I returned to the house, wondering what kind of place lay beyond that trail. 2 weeks after I met Mr. Widemouth, the last load of our things had been packed into a moving truck. I would be in the cab of that truck, sitting next to my father for the long drive to Pennsylvania. I had considered telling Mr. Widemouth that I would be leaving, but even at 5 years old, I was beginning to suspect that perhaps the creature's intentions were not to my benefit, despite what he said otherwise. For this reason, I decided to keep my departure a secret. My father and I were in the truck at 4 a.m. He was hoping to make it to Pennsylvania by lunchtime tomorrow with the help of an endless supply of coffee and a 6-pack of energy drinks. He seemed more like a man who was about to run a marathon rather than one who was about to spend 2 days sitting still. "Early enough for you?" my father asked with a hint of sympathy. I nodded and placed my head against the window, hoping for some sleep before the sun came up. I felt my father's hand on my shoulder. "This is the last move, son, I promise. I know it's hard for you, sick as you've been. Once Daddy gets promoted, we can settle down and you can make friends." My eyes opened as we backed out of the driveway. I saw Mr. Widemouth's silhouette in my bedroom window. He stood motionless until the truck was about to turn onto the main road. He gave a pitiful little wave goodbye, steak knife in hand. I didn't wave back. Years later, I returned to New Vineyard. The piece of land our house stood upon was empty except for the foundation, as the house burned down a few years after my family left. Out of curiosity, I followed the deer trail that Mr. Widemouth had shown me. Part of me expected him to jump out behind a tree and scare the living bejesus out of me, but I felt that Mr. Widemouth was gone, somehow tied to the house that no longer existed. The trail ended at the New Vineyard Memorial Cemetery. I noticed that many of the tombstones belonged to children. The Smiling Man. About 5 years ago, I lived downtown in a major city in the US. I've always been a night person, so I would often find myself bored after my roommate, who was decidedly not a night person, and went to sleep. To pass the time, I used to go for long walks and spend the time thinking. I spent 4 years like that, walking alone at night, and never once had a reason to feel afraid. I always used to joke with my roommate that even the drug dealers in the city were polite. But all of that changed in just a few minutes of one evening. It was a Wednesday, somewhere between 1 and 2 in the morning, and I was walking near a police patrol park quite a ways away from my apartment. It was a quiet night, even for a weeknight, with very little traffic and almost no one on foot. The park, as it was most nights, was completely empty. I turned down a short side street in order to loop back to my apartment when I first noticed him. At the far end of the street, on my side, was the silhouette of a man, dancing. It was a strange dance, similar to a waltz, but he finished each box with an odd forward stride. I guess you could say he was dance walking, and he was headed straight for me. Deciding he was probably drunk, I stepped as close as I could to the road, to give him the majority of the sidewalk to pass me by. The closer he got, the more I realized how gracefully he was moving. He was very tall and lanky and wearing an old suit. He danced closer still, until I could make out his face. His eyes were open wide and wild, head tilted back slightly, looking off at the sky. His mouth was formed in a painfully wide cartoon of a smile. Between the eyes and the smile, I decided to cross the street before he could dance any closer. I took my eyes off of him to cross the empty street. As soon as I reached the other side, I glanced back and then stopped dead in my tracks. He'd stopped dancing, and he was standing with one foot in the street, perfectly parallel to me. He was facing me, but still looking skyward, smile still wide on his lips. I was completely and utterly unnerved by this. I started walking again, but kept my eyes on the man. He didn't move. Once I had put about half a block between us, I turned away from him for a moment to watch the sidewalk in front of me. The street and sidewalk ahead of me were completely empty. Still a bit unnerved, I looked back to where he had been standing, to find him gone. For the briefest of moments, I felt relieved, until I noticed him. He had crossed the street, and he was slightly crouched down. I couldn't tell for sure due to the distance and the shadows, but I was certain he was facing me. I had looked away from him for no more than 10 seconds, so it was clear that he had moved fast. I was so shocked, I stood there for some time, staring at him. And then he started moving toward me again. He took giant, exaggerated, tiptoed steps, as if he were a cartoon character sneaking up on someone. Except he was moving very, very quickly. I'd like to say at this point that I ran away or pulled out my pepper spray or my cell phone or anything at all, but I didn't. I just stood there, completely frozen, as the smiling man crept toward me. And then he stopped again, about a car length away from me. Still smiling a smile, still looking to the sky. When I finally found my voice, I blurted out the first thing that came to my mind. What I meant to ask was, "What the fuck do you want?" in an angry, commanding tone. What came out was more of a whimper. What the fuck? Regardless of whether or not humans can smell fear, they can certainly hear it. I heard it in my own voice, and that only made me more afraid. But he didn't react to it at all. He just stood there, smiling. And then, after what felt like forever, he turned around, very slowly, and started dance walking away. Just like that. Not wanting to turn my back to him again, I just watched him go, until he was far enough away to almost be out of sight. And then I realized something. He wasn't moving away anymore, nor was he dancing. I watched in horror as the distant shape of him grew larger and larger. He was coming back my way, and this time, he was running. I ran too. I ran until I was off the side road and back onto a better lit road with sparse traffic. Looking behind me then, he was nowhere to be found. The rest of the way home, I kept glancing over my shoulder, always expecting to see his stupid smile, but he was never there. I lived in that city for 6 months after that, and I never went out for another walk. There was something about his face that always haunted me. He didn't look drunk. He didn't look high. He looked completely and utterly insane. And that's a very, very scary thing to see. My fear of water. I've always had a fear of being submerged completely in water. Not that I can't swim or anything. My dad made me learn. He said I almost drowned when I was really young. I was afraid of it because, for as long as I can remember, whenever I'm underwater and I look up, I see a woman reaching down to me with a warm smile, with glowing golden hair and dark blue eyes. Even if it's just in a bathtub. It's always happened. It was just normal for me. But I never got used to it. It was unnerving, but also soothing at the same time. She always made me feel like it was okay. I still avoided it though, because I was just a kid and it was really freaky. I never told my dad about it as a kid, but I did ask about my mom. He never wanted to talk about her. Sometimes he even got mad at me for trying too hard to bring it up. It was only recently that I described this apparition to him. He nearly drove into a telephone pole. Obviously he knew something. I asked him again about my mom. He still wouldn't say much, except that she died when I was very young and that she loved me very much. He also admitted that her hair and eyes were those colors, just like mine. So I did some research on my own, looking up her name for myself on my birth certificate to try and find any reference I could. Any news clips about a boy nearly drowning, anything. I mostly wanted a picture, something I could match to my guardian angel. Today, buried in the town library, I found it. Winchester, Marie Wythe, 28, drowned to death yesterday evening after climbing a razor wire fence and fleeing to a nearby reservoir. A funeral is scheduled by her family for the 25th. Marie was institutionalized just 6 months ago after being found not guilty of attempted murder on grounds of insanity. Her husband, Daniel Wythe, had acted quickly enough to rescue their infant child when she was found trying to drown him in a bathtub. A child's eyes. Every child fears under their bed. If they don't, they fear the closet, or maybe that little crack in the almost closed door. Scientists know that children are more perceptive. They see things adults don't. They aren't yet tethered into only accepting what society wants them to accept. They see what is truly there. They see the monsters. If you were to borrow a child's eyes and see through them for a night, you would go insane. To be able to see what you only dimly remember, burrowing into your covers while wearing those train pajamas, hoping to a God you can barely comprehend that it doesn't see you back, would drive an adult crazy. This is because adults forget the rules. 1. Cover yourself. If you can't see it, it can't see you, even if it makes it harder to breathe. 2. Don't make any noise. Even a whimper can lead to destruction. 3. Don't move. It attracts their attention. 4. Only light can make them go away. Bright light. Flashlights make it worse. Teens are caught in the middle. They still feel what's there, but they cannot see, and they forget the rules. Why do you think there are so many insomniacs typing at their computers, subconsciously praying the light from their monitor will be enough to keep them away? It's not. Now look behind you with a child's eyes and try not to scream. She found her way into my home. Please, I don't know what to do. I've tried to tell my wife about this, but she's a science teacher, and thanks to my history of practical jokes, she thinks I'm just kidding. There's something stalking me. I don't know what it is, but almost every night since I started seeing it, it has terrorized me. It doesn't touch me. It doesn't communicate in any sort of way. It just fills me with horror. If I seem to ramble, please forgive me. I haven't slept in several days. We live in the second floor of a duplex with stairs down the back of the house to the basement where the laundry machines are. There's a door at the bottom of the stairs before the door to the basement that looks out into our back porch and into the backyard. 6 days ago, I was going down to the basement to bring up some laundry when I glanced out to the back door. There was a figure standing at the far edge of our yard. Her back was to me, and she was just standing there, looking into the woods beyond our backyard. She was dressed in nothing but a light gown. It had lots of flowing material coming off of it that was whipping around in the air slowly. The whole scene creeped me out instantly, but I thought she might be a friend of our downstairs neighbor, so I continued to the basement. When I came back up, she wasn't there. The next night, I went down again, and as I passed the back door, I looked outside. The woman was back, and she was exactly like how she was the night before, just facing away, not moving. The hair on my arms and neck stood straight up when I saw her. I was even more creeped out when I realized that she was in the same clothes as the night before. That's when I did something I shouldn't have. I opened the back door. Leaning out, I called to her to see if she was okay. She didn't respond. She didn't make any sort of indication that she'd heard me. It was freezing cold, so I shut the door and locked it. Coming back upstairs afterwards, I looked out the window and she was gone again. Later that same night, I was in the bedroom, getting ready to go to sleep. Everything was dark because my wife had gone to bed before me. Our bedroom looks out over to the backyard, and my side of the bed faces the windows, so I have to go past them to get in. As I was doing so, I suddenly got that deep dread feeling in my stomach that I had gotten the first time I saw the figure in the backyard. Something compelled me to hesitate by the windows. My hands were shaking as I pulled the curtain back up a bit and peeked through the shades into the backyard. It was a clear night, so the backyard wasn't shrouded in darkness. The woman was standing in the middle of the backyard, no longer at the edge of the woods, facing the house, with her head tilted up, looking directly at the window I was peeking from. I jerked away instantly, afraid she had seen me. Her face was covered in shadow and hair, but I saw her chin and nose, a sharp nose and a thin chin, gray. Her skin looks gray. Her hair was black and long. I was so scared I jumped into bed and covered myself with the covers. The next day, I played outside in the snow with my 4-year-old daughter. She wanted me to pull her on her sled to the backyard, but just the thought of going back there made me scared again, so I talked her into digging holes in the snow in the front yard. That night, things went from bad to worse. Somehow, I had managed to forget about the woman. Then, in the middle of the night, my daughter started crying. Our bedroom was just across the hall from hers. I thought she might need to use the bathroom or just be having a bad dream, so I went to her room to see if she was okay. She was uncovered, curled up into a ball on her mattress. I pulled the covers over her, and that's when she whispered to me,
"Daddy, there's something in my closet."
I got instant goosebumps. I turned my head slowly toward the door at the end of her bed. Normally, the closet is shut, but now it was open. The woman was standing in my daughter's closet. Not even when it was clear that I saw her did she move or make a sound. She just stood there and looked at me through the cracked open door. "Get up," I told my daughter. "Get in my arms. Quickly, quickly." She scrambled up and hugged me tightly as I walked backwards out of the room, watching the closet the entire time. In my mind, I imagined her throwing the closet door open and running at us, arms outstretched. I just hugged my daughter and walked backwards into my room. The woman never appeared in the doorway. I heard no movement from my daughter's room. I just tucked her into my bed and stood there watching the doorway to her bedroom. I did not go back in. I just stood there and watched and listened. When I finally got the courage to climb into bed, I didn't sleep. Sunday, I told my wife everything. I told her about the first time I saw this woman. I told her about calling out to her and seeing her from the window. I told her that she had appeared in our daughter's closet. She told me it wasn't funny, that it was my fault for our daughter's bad dreams, and that I shouldn't encourage her to be afraid of her closet. Sunday night, my daughter called to me from her room again. Called me a coward, but I couldn't go back into that room. I called her quietly to get in our bed, but she just cried and said she was scared. I wanted to go get her, but I was scared too. I told her to pull her blankets up and cover herself. "Just cover yourself, honey. It'll be okay." I prayed it was true. I lay there, peeking over the sleeping form of my wife and out into the hallway at the closet door of my daughter's room, and just kept praying. I heard her cry a little bit longer, then she went quiet, and I hoped that she was asleep. Monday, I piled toys in the front of the door to her closet. By that time, there was no doubt in my mind that this was some sort of ghost or apparition, but I piled the things in front of her closet anyway. Like a pile of toys could stop a ghost. Monday night, my daughter didn't cry, but I didn't sleep. I lay there looking at the ceiling, just tense. Around 2 a.m., I heard her bedroom door crack, and I knew something was wrong. She must be scared, I thought. So I called to her like before. "Just come to me and you can sleep in our bed, sweetie." But she didn't come. I peeked over my wife. The woman was standing there in the doorway to my daughter's room. Her arms hung at her sides. Her shoulders slouched down. Her gown was dirty, like it hadn't been washed in years, and hung off her like torn rags. I wasn't breathing. I wasn't blinking. I just looked at her, and she looked at me, and I thought, this is it. I'm going to die. She never moved, never made a sound. I whispered, "Please, go away. Please, leave me alone. Please, I'm sorry." I couldn't look away. If I look away, she'll get closer. I was sure of it. If I close my eyes, when I open them, she'll be standing over me, looking at me. At some point, she was gone. It's like I had fallen asleep with my eyes open, but I don't remember her disappearing. Just that I was looking at the doorway and she wasn't there anymore. Last night, I lay awake, waiting. I asked my wife to shut our bedroom door because the nightlight in the hallway was keeping me awake. It was stupid. I didn't know what I was thinking. Like clockwork, I heard my daughter's bedroom door creak open. I held my breath. Then, I heard the floorboards in the hallway creaking as I started shaking uncontrollably. I heard our bedroom door open, and I knew she was standing there, in the doorway, not moving, just looking at me. I didn't look. I couldn't. I did what I told my daughter to do and pulled the covers over my head. I'm a complete mess. I'm a zombie at work. I don't want to go home anymore. I think I see the woman in other places. I glance over while driving and I think she's sitting in the passenger seat of the truck behind me, or standing down the street as I drive off. When I just sit there at my desk, someone passes behind me and I jump. I'm afraid that if I turn around, she'll be there, waiting for me to look at her. And what if I saw her face? I don't want to see it. I don't want to see her anymore. But I don't know what to do. The only hope that I have is, for unrelated reasons, my wife is talking about moving. But our lease isn't up until May. I don't know if I can hold out that long. World's Best School Psychologist. When I was 12, I came to the conclusion that everyone in the world, even my own family, was against me. I was never a problem child, but my parents sure treated me like one. For example, I had to be home by 5 p.m. every day. Clearly restricted my amount of playtime outdoors. I wasn't allowed to have friends over to play at the house, nor was I allowed to go over to anyone else's. I had to finish homework directly after I came home from school, no matter how long it took. My parents refused to buy me video games and forced me to read books, and then write a book report on them to prove I actually read it. Now, even though those rules listed above were quite frustrating as a child, they aren't actually what upset me the most. What really hurt me was the lack of compassion on behalf of my parents. My mother was a bitter woman who always made me feel guilty of accidents or mistakes I've made. My father only knew one emotion: frustration. The only time he spoke to me was when he screamed at me for receiving poor test scores or beat me for misbehaving. But enough about that. Let's talk about my school's psychologist. For his own privacy, we call him Dr. Tanner. Like most junior high schools, a psychologist is always available on campus during school hours to assist any students in need of counseling, whether it be emotional, academic, social, behavioral, etc. To be honest, I've never seen any students talking to Dr. Tanner. Every day I would walk past his office on the way to the cafeteria and peek through his door's little window. He would always be alone in there, working on some paperwork. I guess that most kids were too afraid to speak about their problems to an adult who was practically a stranger. For this reason, it took me 3 weeks to muster enough courage to go into his office. March 2nd, 1993, was the day I decided to voice my troubles to Dr. Tanner. During lunch break, I stood in front of his office door and knocked. Through the window, I could see him raise his head, smile, and motion me to come in. I did. He greeted me by introducing himself and asking for my name. Dr. Tanner was a very soft-spoken man who seemed to radiate kindness. In less than 30 minutes, I rambled to Dr. Tanner about how mean my parents were to me and how they didn't care about me at all. After a while, my voice began to quiver and I stopped speaking. The psychologist listened patiently to the whole spiel, arms folded and head nodding. I half expected him to begin talking about how everything I had just said was untrue and that my parents loved me dearly and blah blah blah, but he didn't. Dr. Tanner leaned towards me with a grin on his face and said, "You know, I'm the best school psychologist in the world. I promise you, we will fix this." I rolled my eyes. "Okay, but how?" I asked. "I have my ways," he replied. "I'm a man of my word. I promise that within just 1 month, the relationship between you and your parents will change for the better, forever." After a brief pause, he continued, "Although, I do need you to make me a promise. You have to promise me that you'll come back to my office after school and that you won't tell anyone that we had this conversation today. It'll be our little secret." I promised. The following day, I returned to Dr. Tanner after school. It was around 4 p.m. when I entered his office. After a warm welcome, he asked me to have a seat in front of his desk once again. Upon sitting down, I watched Dr. Tanner close the blinds at the door's tiny window. "There," he smiled. "Now we have all the privacy we need." We began to talk about my likes and interests, my favorite subjects in school, my least favorite teachers, and things of the like. About an hour into the conversation, Dr. Tanner offered me a soft drink. I gladly took the offer, considering my parents never allowed me to drink soda. Dr. Tanner reached over to his mini fridge and fidgeted around before setting down 2 open cans of soda on his desk. Afterwards, we continued to talk about what was going on in my life, but it wasn't long before I passed out from whatever drugs Dr. Tanner placed in my drink. It took me a minute or so to adjust my blurred vision upon waking up. And when it did, I had no idea what to think. I was handcuffed to a bed and my mouth was sealed with duct tape. I immediately began to panic, squirming around and tugging the cuffs, but gave up soon after. My eyes widened in disbelief after looking around the room. There were posters of superheroes pinned up along the walls and photographs of famous athletes on shelves. In the middle of the room was an old television and Super Nintendo with various game cartridges stacked alongside of it. I didn't know what to think. Here I am in a room filled with items most kids would die to play with. I would have probably cried from joy hadn't I been cuffed to a bed frame. My stomach sank once again as the door opened and Dr. Tanner walked inside. He sat down on the edge of the bed. "Now, listen," he said. "Remember that I'm here to help you and that I would never hurt you, okay?" Dr. Tanner gently removed the tape from my mouth and then the cuffs from my hands. My first instinct was to begin crying, but something about Dr. Tanner made me feel safe. He smiled at me. "You're going to be staying with me for a while," he continued. "And during this time, you're allowed to play with any toys in this room while I'm here at home. But when I leave the house, I need to cuff one of your hands to the back of the bed. You can still watch the television, but I want you to watch the news channels while I'm away." I sat in silence, still trying to process the information he'd given to me. "So," Dr. Tanner yipped and slapped me on the knee. "You go ahead and knock yourself out. I'll be back when it's time for dinner." He got up from the bed, walked across the room and clicked the TV's power button before locking the door behind him. Several more minutes passed before I realized that Dr. Tanner wasn't joking. All that was left for me to do was boot up the Nintendo and play Mario until nightfall. Around 7 p.m., Dr. Tanner returned to the room carrying 2 plates of mashed potatoes and chicken strips. I finally gathered up enough courage to ask him how long I'd be staying with him. "Well, about a month," he replied. "Give or take a few weeks. I just have some work I need to do." The following morning, I awoke to Dr. Tanner's hand patting my head. "Hey, bud. You don't have to wake up right now if you don't want to, but I'm going to need to put this back on," he whispered, clamping the cold steel handcuff to my wrist. I gazed up at him. He was wearing a collared shirt and slacks, a coat draped over his shoulder, and a suitcase at his side. He looked just how he always did when I saw him around school. Before leaving, he placed the TV remote next to me and told me to turn it on to watch the news. The first thing I saw upon turning on the news was a breaking news segment. An important-looking police officer stood at the podium, surrounded by people with microphones. I happened to begin viewing halfway through his speech. "A statewide Amber Alert has been issued as of this morning. We have several investigators working towards identifying potential abductors, but as of right now, there's not much evidence. Faculty members state that the boy had been last seen around 4 or 5 in the evening on." I began to feel nauseous as a photograph of me appeared on the screen. It was my yearbook picture from last year. Captions for the photograph displayed my name and age, my school, and my town. Above my picture were alerting titles: FBI begins search for child, and kidnapped suspect unknown, and potential runaway. The live footage continued, and 2 figures I soon recognized as my mom and dad stepped up to the podium. Both appeared to have reddened eyes, tears streaming down my mother's face as she took hold of the microphone. I'd never seen so much emotion come from my mother before, as she wept on live television, stuttering on sentences such as, "Please return my baby back to me," and "I'm so sorry," and "Please come home to us." When my father took the microphone, I nearly expected his attitude to be stone cold, but he too had tears in his eyes. He pleaded to the world to bring his son home safely, and lastly begged for my forgiveness. I turned the power off shortly after. My emotions were mixed, for I had never once seen my father cry. I felt miserable that my parents were being put through so much, but at the same time, I felt relief. I now know how much my mom and dad love me. Nearly 4 weeks had passed, and Dr. Tanner had been treating me with the utmost respect. He leaves me in the room, cuffed to the bed frame, but returns in the afternoon to eat lunch and dinner with me, talk, and play games. I never would have guessed how good Dr. Tanner was at Monopoly or Scrabble. But one morning, when Dr. Tanner woke me before heading to work, I noticed a stern look on his face. I also realized that it was 3 hours earlier than when he usually wakes me. "You need to watch the news today, no exceptions. I want you to keep the television on all day and pay close attention to it," he stated grimly. I, of course, complied and watched him exit the room. About 2 hours later, the breaking news segment interrupted the toothpaste commercial I was watching. The title, "Human Remnants Found." 2 staunch-looking men in suits stood aside one another and began speaking. "We are displeased to bring up such unfortunate news this morning regarding our missing child case from earlier this month." One of the men bowed his head while the other speaking shuffled through some papers. He continued, "The remains of a body have been found in a garbage bag beneath the highway overpass. The body appeared to be that of a child, although not much is left. The body has been decapitated and much of it burnt to ash and bone." The screen shifted over to a helicopter view of the freeway. Dozens of police cars gathered near the bottom of the tall overpass. The man's voice could still be heard. Within the bag, police found a junior high school identification card, labeled as such. The screen showed the school ID card I always kept in my backpack. The plastic was sort of melted away, but the photograph and name were intact. After the 2 men dismissed themselves, the camera panned over to my parents. They were sitting among reporters. My mother's face held a painful grimace, and my father sulked his head down at his knees. I shut the television off. Dr. Tanner returned home very late. He hurried into the room, unlocked my cuffs, and placed a bottle of fizzing water in my hand. He placed his hands onto my shoulders and smiled. I made a promise, didn't I? I nodded, tears squeezing their way out of my eyes. You need to make me a promise again, he whispered. He told me that I needed to drink all the water in the bottle. It would help me sleep, and that from here on, I am never to tell anyone that I ever met him. I promised. I told you I'm the best school psychologist in the world, didn't I? And he was right. I woke later that night to find myself laying in the middle of a park, stars shining brightly across the night sky. I recognized the park. It wasn't too far from my school. Down the road, I saw my house. The lights were off inside, but I could make out my father sitting on the steps leading to the front door. I hesitantly called out to him. He lifted his head slowly, but when he saw it was me, he sprang to his feet, ran towards me with open arms, yelling my name. My mother erupted from the house behind him. Dr. Tanner was right. Things have changed with my family and I. My parents smile more often and treat me lovingly. I couldn't ask for a more perfect ending. Even now and then, I see Dr. Tanner on campus, talking to and from his office. Rarely do we ever make eye contact, let alone speak to one another, but sometimes he'll shoot me a wink and smile. I'll always keep my promise to him and pretend I never met him. But there will always be one question forever floating in my mind. Who did Dr. Tanner decapitate and throw off the overpass?